When 4 certified cave divers got their visas to dive in America, they headed straight to the Manatee Springs Cave System for what should have been a quick exploration of the caves, but their adventures turned into a nightmare when a powerful flow of current took over the water and only 3 of them were able to get out alive.
We're searching for the body of a woman who was diving at Manatee Springs State Park.
This is just a horrific accident.
Min was a certified diver who came to the U.S. specifically to dive sites like Manatee Springs.
A very experienced diver that just found herself in a very, very bad situation, and unfortunately, it cost her her life.
On Sunday, the 24th of November 2019, 4 divers arrived from China in the US and went straight to the Manatee Springs. Dressed in their diving costumes, the 4 of them split into 2 groups. The first group was made up of a cave diving instructor named Wang, who was the most experienced with over 500 hours of diving. His partner was Chen with 100 hours of experience. The second group was made of Zhou Min and her husband Fu Shaiyu, both of whom had just had 11 hours of experience each. Far less than the other group, but the experience was the least of their problems that day. You see, the only diver who had been into the Manatee Springs before was Wang, but this had been some years ago, and unfortunately for all of them, a lot had changed since then. Wang didn't read any updates on the nature of the caves, and there had been a lot of new things to learn about. For example, due to the heavy rain some day before, the current in the spring had become stronger. What was worse was the tunnels had collapsed and divers were told to avoid them. Wang and his team, unfortunately, knew nothing about any of this. To enter the cave system, they had 2 entrances. The Manatee Springs itself, with bubbles on the surface because of the crazy current underneath, or the Catfish Hotel dive site, which has a duckweed top layer but clear freshwater underneath. The current here was a little bit more friendly. From the Catfish Hotel, divers can then enter the tunnels leading to the main caves. Being more experienced, Wang and Chen were the first to enter the hotel using rebreathers and dive propulsion vehicles to determine the conditions of the paths. They made their way against the current towards Friedman Sink, which was a cave located within the Manatee Springs. A few minutes later, they reported that the visibility down there wasn't great, but they said it wasn't too bad either. So they continued to dive deeper into the springs, and 35 minutes later, they were 1,600 feet deep where Friedman Sink was. Convinced that the area was safe, they decided to swim back up to meet with Min and Fu, who were still waiting at the surface. Using less sophisticated devices than what the first team had used, Min and Fu dove into the springs. As they swam down, they met Wang and Chen on the way at around 500 feet from the exit. They checked on their oxygen levels and proceeded with the exploration, but this time as a single unit. However, the force of the current was starting to build up as water overflowed from an aquifer nearby. This change in current soon forced a surge of water against the tunnels, bringing down some of their walls. Some of their passageways were now blocked. Wang and the others were trying to make it to the exit when they were hit with a huge challenge. There was no exit to be found anymore. Where they had seen moments ago had now turned completely black due to the tunnels broken down by the rushing water. Confused, they tried to look for an alternative exit strategy, but the current of the water was becoming more and more unbearable. The overflow was so strong that it not only blurred their paths, it was also making them swim against their will. But they managed to swim up the slope of the cave. However, up there, the current had also increased, making it a tough challenge for all of them. Wang was the first to suffer terribly from the overflow. As he swam upstream, the water pushed him against a hard wall. Stuck, he made several attempts to overcome the current by pushing against it. But this only made things worse because the power of the overflow was so strong. It broke his rebreather in half. He started to choke, but then Min caught sight of him and alerted her husband. Together they attempted to swim towards the choking Wang, but unfortunately they couldn't. The current was so strong and they weren't too far from him, so they used their light to signal to him that they were going to call for help. But whichever way Min and Fu tried to escape from, they were hit hard by a current. Worse, they couldn't even see where they were going and were basically swimming blind in any direction. As for Chen, he had been pulled into a big hole and was struggling to get out of it. Wang, who was still choking, was trying desperately to control his breath while still attempting to leave his current state. Then the current loosened up a bit and he caught sight of Chen. He then managed to swim to where he was stuck. When he got to Chen, he grabbed him and tried to pull him out, but unfortunately it was impossible. So he let him go, and as soon as he did, the current started to flow in his favor. The gush was now moving up, and with Wang now loose and without any obstructions in his way, it pushed him to his shallow surface where he could bring his head out for air. He was safe. With the current now moving up, they were finally in luck. Chen, who had been stuck, was propelled out of the cave, and so was Fu. Unfortunately, as Mian made to join them outside, a sudden surge of water dragged her into a cavern nearby, plastering her against its wall. The grip of the current was strong, and Mian couldn't move despite her best efforts. With all her companions outside the cave, she was now alone and scared. But she was a fighter. She made several attempts to pull herself out of the hole, and every time she grew weaker and weaker. But she remained determined. However, every time she seemed to be making progress, the rushing water pushed her further into the hole. Then, somehow, things became even worse. The current started to push rocks and debris into the hole where she was caught. Her limbs were now trapped and she could barely move. But there was an even bigger concern. Her oxygen level was gradually leveling down, and with her panicking, the decrease was fast. Fu, seeing that his wife was yet to emerge on the surface, ran to call for help in the park duty station. Chen, who had been stuck in the big hole, was severely injured and couldn't do much but lie on the platform outside the cave waiting for first responders. Wang, on the other hand, couldn't wait for anybody. He knew Min was in serious trouble, and seeing that he was more experienced than the others, he dove back into the springs. But he couldn't even make it through the surface as the violent stream pushed against any dive. After several attempts, he gave up and prayed that help would come sooner. 20 minutes later, an ambulance arrived, but no police or rescue teams just yet. The ambulance took the injured Chen for treatment in a hospital where he would make a full recovery. As for Min, she was nowhere near getting out of her trap. The overflowing stream wasn't letting up, and her oxygen level continued to deplete. Struggling for her life, her air tank eventually emptied. With no air coming from anywhere, her nostrils and mouth started to inhale and gulp in copious amounts of cave water. Worse, the strong current ensured that she didn't even have a chance to fight back. Plus, her hands were now completely trapped by rocks and debris that had now surrounded her. Her drowning was swift and painful, and in a matter of minutes, she stopped struggling and went totally limp. Her husband was devastated on the surface, knowing that his wife would run out of air anytime soon if help didn't come. It took 1 hour for the rescue team to get there. The team dove into the cave immediately after they arrived, but like what Wang experienced when he tried to reach Min, they too were held back by the heavy current. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't get very far and had to exit the water before they got stuck themselves. They made 2 more attempts but failed each time and had to call it a day in hopes that the current would be better the following day. It was already late in the evening, and with Min not emerging on the surface by herself, everyone knew that she was already dead. They could just hope maybe a miracle could happen. However, on Monday the following day, the underwater cave rescue recovery team attempted the dive again. This time they were able to reach Min's lifeless body. Getting her out of the rocky hold was a huge problem, so they had to remove several bits of rock and debris before dragging her out of the trap. That was just an awful way to die. Being stuck, scared, not knowing if help will come. And this reminds me of the story of Floyd Collins, who was also stuck in a cave, except in his case he was there for 17 days. You can check out that story here.